When a grieving widower opens the blue suitcase his late wife cherished for decades, he discovers hundreds of letters she kept hidden their entire marriage. Inside he finds the shocking truth. Their beloved daughter wasn't abandoned as they'd been told. She was stolen from a young mother who never stopped searching for her child. Frank Sullivan stood in the doorway of the bedroom he'd shared with his wife for 42 years, unable to cross the threshold. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's funeral, yet her presence still filled the room. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her worn slippers beside the bed, her favorite cardigan draped over the chair by the window. His daughter Rebecca had gently suggested it was time to sort through Margaret's belongings, a task Frank had been avoiding with increasing desperation. "Just start with something small, Dad," she'd said on the phone that morning. "Maybe her nightstand drawer, or that old blue suitcase she kept in the closet." The blue suitcase. Frank's gaze drifted to the closet door, and he felt a twinge of curiosity pierce through his grief. Margaret had always kept that vintage Samsonite case locked, telling him it contained just old memories whenever he'd asked. In 42 years of marriage, he'd respected her privacy and never pressed the issue. Now standing alone in their bedroom, Frank finally stepped inside and approached the closet. He pulled the chain on the light bulb and pushed aside hanging clothes until he spotted it on the top shelf. Dusty but still that same rich cobalt blue that had caught Margaret's eye at a flea market decades ago. Frank reached up and carefully brought the suitcase down, surprised by its weight. He set it on the bed and stared at the small brass lock. Where would the key be? After searching through Margaret's jewelry box and desk drawers with no success, he noticed her keychain still hanging on the hook by the bedroom door. Among the familiar keys was a small brass one he'd never paid much attention to. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Frank lifted the lid and gasped. The suitcase was filled with letters, hundreds of them carefully bundled with faded ribbon, each bundle labeled by year. On top lay a worn leather journal, and a sealed envelope with his name written in Margaret's flowing handwriting, "For Frank, to be opened only after I'm gone." His heart pounding, Frank picked up the envelope. Whatever secret Margaret had kept all these years was finally ready to be revealed. He broke the seal and unfolded several pages covered in his wife's handwriting. "My dearest Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, I've finally found the courage to tell you the truth, though only after death has taken that burden from me. I'm sorry for my cowardice." Frank sank onto the edge of the bed, Margaret's confession unfolding before him like a map to a place he'd never known existed. The story she revealed made his heart race and his breath catch in his throat. It concerned their daughter Rebecca, the child they'd adopted as an infant after being told her teenage mother had abandoned her at the hospital. But according to Margaret's letter, that wasn't the truth at all. The story began in 1975, when Margaret had gone to stay with her cousin Virginia in Chicago for several months. Virginia worked as a nurse at a private adoption agency with questionable practices. When Margaret, desperate after years of failing to conceive, confided in Virginia about their struggle, her cousin made a proposal. "There's a girl coming in next week," Virginia had whispered. 17, from a good family. "They're sending her away to have the baby quietly. I can arrange everything." Margaret described how she'd initially refused, insisting they would continue pursuing legal adoption, but then Virginia called with news that changed everything. The young mother had supposedly abandoned her newborn at the hospital and disappeared. The baby, a perfect, healthy girl, needed a home immediately. "I told myself I was rescuing her," Margaret wrote. "I told myself it was meant to be." Frank's vision blurred with tears as he read how Margaret had stayed in Chicago, pretending to be the one giving birth. How she'd returned home with their daughter, creating an elaborate story about a confidential adoption through a Chicago agency that had since closed. But the truth had started to unravel almost immediately. 2 weeks after bringing Rebecca home, Margaret received a frantic call from Virginia. The young mother had not abandoned her baby. She'd been told her daughter had died during delivery. When she demanded to see the body, the agency staff realized they needed to act quickly. They told her the remains had already been cremated. But she didn't believe them, Frank, Margaret wrote. She knew in her heart her baby was alive. And she started asking questions, dangerous questions. The letter detailed how the young mother, Caroline Miller, had spent years investigating, getting closer and closer to the truth. That's when the letters had begun arriving. Letter after letter from Caroline to various adoption agencies, hospitals and government offices. Somehow Virginia had intercepted them and sent them to Margaret as warnings. Each letter was a knife in my heart, Margaret confessed. I watched this young woman's desperate search continue year after year. I read her words and felt her pain, even as I held her child in my arms each night. Frank set down the letter, his hands shaking too badly to continue. He looked at the bundles of letters in the suitcase, understanding now what they were. 40 years of correspondence from Rebecca's biological mother, never reaching their intended recipients, chronicling a lifetime of searching for a daughter who had been stolen, not abandoned. And Margaret had kept them all. Frank forced himself to continue reading. The most shocking revelation came near the end of Margaret's confession. 5 years ago, Caroline Miller had finally tracked them down. She had confronted Margaret at a grocery store, not with rage or threats, but with a simple question: is she happy? Margaret described the conversation, how she had admitted everything, expecting Caroline to expose the fraud and destroy their family. Instead, Caroline had made an impossible choice. After learning about Rebecca's life, her loving upbringing, her success as a teacher, her own children, Caroline had decided not to disrupt the only family her daughter had ever known. She asked only to see Rebecca from a distance just once, Margaret wrote. We sat in her car across from Rebecca's school and watched her walk her kindergarten class to the playground. Caroline wept silently beside me, watching her daughter, a grown woman with children of her own, living a life that had been stolen from them both. The letter ended with a plea. I don't ask for forgiveness, Frank. What I did, what Virginia and I did, was unforgivable. But Rebecca deserves to know the truth, and Caroline deserves to know her daughter. I leave that decision in your hands, along with the burden I've carried alone for too long. I'm sorry. Frank sat motionless, the letter clutched in his hands. Outside, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the bedroom he'd shared with a woman he now realized he hadn't fully known. The weight of Margaret's secret and her decades of silent guilt was almost incomprehensible. He reached for the leather journal that had lain atop the letters and opened it to the first page. It was Margaret's diary, begun the day they'd brought Rebecca home. Page after page documented her joy in motherhood alongside her growing remorse. The entries became more anguished as the years passed and the letters from Caroline continued to arrive. Frank couldn't bear to read more. He closed the journal and turned instead to the bundles of letters. He untied the ribbon from the earliest bundle and opened the first envelope, dated October 1975, just weeks after Rebecca's birth. To whom it may concern, it began in a youthful, determined handwriting. My name is Caroline Miller. On September 18, 1975, I gave birth to a baby girl at Lakeside Hospital in Chicago. I was told she died, but I don't believe it. I held her. She was breathing. She was perfect. Frank read letter after letter, watching as Caroline's handwriting matured, but her determination never wavered. Letters to hospitals, adoption agencies, government officials, private investigators. The early ones were filled with raw grief and desperate hope. Later ones showed a more strategic approach, as Caroline educated herself about adoption procedures and patients' rights. In one heartbreaking letter from 1982, she wrote, "My daughter would be 7 now, starting 2nd grade. Does she like to read? Does she know how to ride a bike? Does she wonder about me the way I wonder about her every single day?" Frank couldn't continue. He carefully retied the letters and placed them back in the suitcase. The sun had set, and the bedroom was dark now, save for the small lamp on the nightstand. He felt overwhelmed by grief for Margaret, by shock at her deception, by sorrow for Caroline's decades of searching, and by fear of what this truth would mean for Rebecca. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Frank made a decision. He would find Caroline Miller first, before telling Rebecca anything. He needed to understand who this woman was and what she wanted after all these years. Margaret's journal had included Caroline's contact information from their meeting 5 years ago. Frank dialed the number with trembling fingers, not knowing if it would still be in service or what he would say if someone answered. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was warm, with a slight Midwestern accent. "Is this Caroline Miller?" Frank asked, his voice unsteady. A pause. "Yes, this is Caroline." Frank took a deep breath. "My name is Frank Sullivan. I believe you knew my wife, Margaret. She passed away recently." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When Caroline finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She told you?" "Yes," Frank said. "I found the letters, all of them." Another long pause. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mr. Sullivan." The simple kindness in her voice, offering condolences to the man whose wife had stolen her child, broke something open in Frank's chest. "Would you be willing to meet with me? Before I talk to Rebecca, I think we should talk first." "I've been waiting for this call for 40 years, Mr. Sullivan." Caroline replied, "I can be on a plane tomorrow." They agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop in Frank's neighborhood. Frank arrived early, securing a table in the corner where they could talk privately. He had brought the blue suitcase, though he wasn't sure why. Perhaps as evidence or perhaps as some kind of offering. When Caroline walked in, Frank recognized her immediately. There was something in the set of her shoulders, the shape of her eyes, features he had seen in his daughter and grandchildren without ever knowing their origin. Caroline was in her early 60s now, her dark hair streaked with silver, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. She spotted Frank and walked directly to his table, her eyes taking in the blue suitcase with a flicker of recognition. "Miss Sullivan," she said, extending her hand. "Frank, please," he replied, standing to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming." They sat across from each other, two strangers connected by an impossible situation. Frank struggled to find the right words to begin. "How do you start a conversation with the woman whose child was stolen by your wife?" Caroline broke the silence. "I don't blame you, Frank. Margaret's journal made it clear you didn't know." Frank looked up sharply. "Her journal?" Caroline nodded. "She sent it to me about a month ago, with a letter explaining that she was ill, that she wanted me to have it, and to know that she had finally found the courage to tell you and Rebecca the truth." Frank felt a rush of emotions, anger that Margaret had contacted Caroline without telling him, sadness that his wife had carried this burden alone, even in her final days, and a strange relief that she had taken at least this small step toward making amends. "I had no idea she was in touch with you," he said finally. "Just the once," Caroline assured him. "After our meeting 5 years ago, we didn't communicate again until her letter arrived last month." Frank nodded, then reached for the blue suitcase. "She kept all your letters," he said, opening it to show Caroline. "Every single one." Caroline's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she saw the bundles of letters, her words, her search, her heart, preserved for decades. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward them. Frank nodded, and Caroline gently lifted one of the bundles, untying the ribbon with trembling fingers. "I sent so many," she whispered, "to hospitals, agencies, lawyers. I never knew if anyone was even reading them." "She read them all," Frank said quietly. "In her letter to me, she said each one was like a knife in her heart." Caroline looked up, her eyes meeting Frank's. "I never wanted revenge, you know. Even when I discovered the truth that Margaret and her cousin had taken my baby and lied to me, all I wanted was to know my daughter, to tell her she was loved, that she wasn't abandoned." Frank nodded, understanding in a way he couldn't have imagined just days ago. "Tell me about yourself, Caroline. Tell me who Rebecca's mother is." Over the next 2 hours, Frank learned Caroline's story. She had been a 17-year-old high school senior when she'd become pregnant. Her parents, strict and concerned about appearances, had sent her to live with an aunt in Chicago until the baby was born. The plan had been for her to give the child up for adoption and return home as if nothing had happened. But the moment Caroline held her daughter, everything changed. "I knew I couldn't give her up," she told Frank. "I had already decided to keep her, no matter what my parents said. I had even named her Elizabeth, after my grandmother." When the nurses took the baby for a routine checkup and never returned, Caroline had known something was wrong. When they told her the baby had died suddenly, she demanded to see her, to hold her one last time. The evasive answers from the hospital staff had only strengthened her suspicion. No mother would accept that, Caroline said firmly. No mother would believe her healthy baby had suddenly died without explanation. She described the years that followed, how she'd finished high school and then college, all while continuing her search. How she'd become a social worker, helping other young women navigate pregnancy and adoption. How she'd married and had 2 more children, though she never stopped searching for her firstborn. "Did you ever tell your family about her?" Frank asked. Caroline nodded. "My husband knew from the beginning. My other children grew up knowing they had an older sister somewhere. They've helped me search over the years." Frank felt a pang of grief for Rebecca, for all she didn't know about this woman, and the siblings who had grown up knowing about her. "What do you want now, Caroline?" he asked. "After all this time?" Caroline considered the question carefully. "I want what I've always wanted. For my daughter to know she wasn't abandoned, that she was loved and wanted from the first moment, that I never stopped looking for her." She paused, then added, "But I don't want to destroy her world, Frank. You and Margaret were her parents in all the ways that truly matter." Frank nodded, grateful for her understanding. "She should know the truth," he said quietly. She deserves that much. They agreed to meet again the following day, this time with Rebecca. Frank didn't tell his daughter why he'd asked her to come home for the weekend, only that it was important. That night, alone in the house that suddenly felt full of secrets, Frank opened Margaret's journal again. He read her final entry, dated just weeks before her death. I hope they can forgive me, Frank, Rebecca, and Caroline most of all. I hope they can build something new from the broken pieces I'm leaving behind. Love doesn't follow the rules we think it should. It expands to include what we never imagined possible. The next day, Frank sat in the living room with Rebecca, trying to find the words to begin. At 40, Rebecca was the image of her biological mother. The same determined chin, the same expressive eyes. How had he never seen it before? "Dad, you're scaring me," Rebecca said, reaching for his hand. "What's going on?" Frank took a deep breath. "Honey, I found something after Mom died. Something she kept hidden for a very long time." He pointed to the blue suitcase on the coffee table. "It's about you, about your adoption." Rebecca's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You and Mom adopted me as a baby." The agency closed. "What's there to know?" Frank's heart ached as he realized she was repeating the story they had told her all her life. The story Margaret had fabricated to hide the truth. "That's not exactly what happened," he said gently. "Your mother, your birth mother, never abandoned you. She was told you had died." The doorbell rang before Frank could continue, and Rebecca looked at him in confusion. "Are you expecting someone?" Frank nodded. "There's someone you should meet." He opened the door to find Caroline standing on the porch, her expression a mixture of hope and terror. Frank gestured for her to come in, leading her to the living room where Rebecca waited. Rebecca stood as they entered, her eyes moving curiously from her father to the stranger. But as she looked at Caroline, something flickered across her face, recognition at some subconscious level, as if seeing her own reflection in an unexpected place. "Rebecca," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet Caroline Miller, your biological mother." The story that unfolded over the next few hours would forever change all their lives. Rebecca listened in stunned silence, as Frank explained what he had discovered: the deception, the stolen child, the decades of searching. When he finished, Rebecca turned to Caroline, her expression unreadable. "You never stopped looking for me." Caroline shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Not for a single day." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she had learned. Then she asked the question that had been forming since the moment she saw Caroline. "Do I have siblings?" Caroline smiled through her tears. "A brother and a sister. James is 35, and Melissa is 32. They've known about you their whole lives. They've been helping me search," Caroline continued. "They call you their ghost sister. They've always wanted to meet you." Frank watched as Rebecca absorbed this information, that there were people in the world connected to her by blood, who had known about her and wanted her even when she had no knowledge of them. He saw the moment it overwhelmed her, saw her hands begin to tremble. "I need some air," Rebecca said suddenly, standing and walking quickly to the back door. Frank started to follow, but Caroline placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Give her time," she said softly. "It's a lot to process." They waited in silence, watching through the window as Rebecca paced the backyard, the same yard where she had played as a child, where she had grown up loved and secure in the family that had been built on a terrible lie. When Rebecca finally returned, her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "I don't know what to feel," she admitted. "The parents I've loved my whole life aren't who I thought they were. And you," she looked at Caroline, "you're my mother, but you're a stranger." "I understand," Caroline said gently. "I'm not here to replace anyone or to demand anything. I just wanted you to know the truth, that you were loved from the beginning, that you were never abandoned." Rebecca nodded, then turned to Frank. "Did Mom know all this time?" The pain in her voice broke Frank's heart. "Yes," he said simply. "She did." "And you didn't?" "Not until I found the suitcase," Frank confirmed. "Your mother, Margaret, she carried this secret alone." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What happens now?" It was the question they were all wondering, and none of them had an answer. How do you rebuild a family from such broken pieces? How do you integrate a lifetime of separation? "I think," Frank said slowly, "we take it one day at a time. We get to know each other. We find a way forward together." Rebecca looked at Caroline, really studying her face, the face that had given her so many of her own features. "I'd like to meet them," she said finally. "My brother and sister." Caroline's face lit up with hope. They would love that. Whenever you're ready. And I have questions, Rebecca continued. So many questions. I'll answer everything I can, Caroline promised. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the three of them remained in the living room talking, crying, and occasionally even laughing as they began the delicate process of weaving together the separated strands of their lives. Frank watched as his daughter discovered pieces of herself in this woman who had never stopped searching for her, and he felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for Margaret, anger at her deception, but also a strange sense of rightness, as if something long broken was finally being mended. Months later, Frank stood in the backyard of Caroline's home, watching as Rebecca laughed with her biological siblings, their children playing together on the grass. What had begun in tragedy had somehow, against all odds, transformed into something healing for all of them. "She looks happy," Caroline said, coming to stand beside him. Frank nodded. "She's aching. Having you all in her life, it's filled in pieces she never knew were missing." "Thank you," Caroline said quietly, "for being the father she needed, for raising her with so much love." Frank's eyes stung with tears. "I only wish Margaret could see this," he admitted. "See that sharing the truth didn't destroy our family, it expanded it." Caroline slipped her hand into his, a gesture of comfort between two people who had found an unlikely friendship through the most difficult of circumstances. "I think she does see it," she said softly. "I think she finally found the forgiveness she was looking for." From across the yard, Rebecca caught sight of them and smiled. A smile that held acknowledgement of all they had lost and all they had found. A family built not just of blood or law or custom, but of truth finally spoken and heard. Of love that had expanded beyond boundaries to include what none of them had imagined possible. The blue suitcase now sat on a shelf in Frank's study, no longer locked, no longer hiding its secrets. Inside, the letters remained, but they had been joined by new correspondence, emails printed out, birthday cards, photos of Rebecca with her biological family, a chronicle not just of loss and searching, but of finding and healing. One afternoon, almost a year after the truth had been revealed, Frank received a call from Rebecca. "Dad, I've been thinking," she began, her voice filled with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Mom's birthday is next week." Frank had been avoiding thinking about it. The first of Margaret's birthdays since her death, since the discovery of her secret. He wasn't sure how to honor the memory of a woman whose life had contained such profound deception alongside such genuine love. "I was thinking we could all have dinner together," Rebecca continued. "You, me, Caroline, James, and Melissa, to remember Mom." Frank was stunned into silence. "You want to celebrate your mother's birthday with your mother?" he finally managed. Rebecca's laugh was soft but genuine. "I know it sounds strange, but I've been talking with my therapist about this. About about understanding that people can make terrible mistakes and still be worthy of love." Frank felt a tightness in his chest, grief and pride intermingled. "What about Caroline? How would she feel about celebrating Margaret's birthday?" "I already asked her," Rebecca said. "She said yes immediately. Dad, she understands better than anyone what Mom must have gone through. The desperation for a child, the impossible choice once she realized what had happened, the lifetime of guilt." Frank shook his head in wonder at the capacity for compassion his daughter possessed, a quality he'd always attributed to his and Margaret's parenting, but which he now recognized might have come from Caroline as well. "Then yes," he said. "I think that would be fitting." The dinner was held in Frank's home, around the table where Rebecca had grown up. Frank cooked Margaret's favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, while Caroline brought homemade apple pie. James and Melissa arrived with flowers and a gentle warmth that had characterized all their interactions with their newfound sister and her family. As they gathered around the table, an empty chair was left at the head, a silent acknowledgement of Margaret's absence and presence in their unusual gathering. The conversation flowed easily, stories of Margaret interwoven with childhood memories from both households. "She taught me to braid my hair when I was 7, Rebecca reminisced. "She had the patience of a saint, trying over and over until my fingers got it right." "You get that patience from Caroline," James offered. "You should see her teaching her first-grade class. The woman could outlast a stone." Everyone laughed and Rebecca smiled at the comparison. It had become easier over the months to accept these connections, to see herself reflected in people she hadn't known existed a year ago. As the evening drew to a close, Caroline raised her glass. "To Margaret," she said, her voice steady and sincere, "who loved Rebecca with her whole heart, and gave her a wonderful life and father." Frank felt tears prick his eyes at this extraordinary gesture of forgiveness from the woman who had most reason to harbor bitterness. To Margaret, he echoed, raising his own glass. And to family, all of it, complicated as it is. After the guests had departed, Frank found Rebecca standing in the living room, looking at the family photos arranged on the mantel. She had added new ones recently, pictures of her with James and Melissa, photos of their children playing together, a formal portrait of the entire blended family at Christmas. I used to think family was simple, she said without turning around. Now I know it's the most complex thing in the world. Frank moved to stand beside her, studying the visual history of their lives. Do you regret knowing the truth? He asked softly. Rebecca considered the question for a long moment. No, she said finally. It was devastating at first, learning that the foundation of my life contained such a profound lie. But knowledge is better than ignorance, even when it hurts. She touched a photo of herself as a baby, cradled in Margaret's arms. I have two mothers now, one who raised me and one who never stopped looking for me. Not many people can say that. Frank nodded, understanding what she meant. The truth had brought pain, but it had also brought healing and an expanded definition of family that none of them could have imagined. I think Mom would be relieved, Rebecca continued, to know that her greatest fear that the truth would destroy everything didn't come true. That love is more resilient than that. Frank put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, grateful beyond words for her wisdom and her heart. 2 years after Margaret's death, Frank stood in the backyard of Caroline's home for another family gathering. This time it was a celebration. Rebecca had just been promoted to principal of her elementary school, and both sides of her family had come together to mark the occasion. As Frank helped James set up the grill, he marveled at how natural it all felt now, this expanded family that transcended biology and law and convention. Caroline's husband Michael passed them plates for the burgers, while Melissa's children played tag with Rebecca's son around the maple tree. Penny for your thoughts, Caroline said, joining Frank as he watched the scene before him. Just thinking about how far we've come, he replied, from that first meeting in the coffee shop to this. He gestured to the yard full of people connected by the most unlikely of circumstances. Caroline nodded, understanding. I never imagined this when I was searching for Rebecca. I thought finding her would be the end of the story. I never considered it might be the beginning of something new. Frank watched as Rebecca moved between her two families with ease, laughing with James about some shared joke, helping Melissa's daughter with her shoelaces, checking in with her own husband and son. She had somehow woven these separate threads into a cohesive whole, creating something beautiful from what could have been only loss and division. She gets that from you, you know, Frank said, that ability to build bridges, to see the possibility for connection where others might see only walls. Caroline smiled, touched by his words. I think she gets it from both of us, from all of us. As the evening progressed and the backyard filled with laughter and conversation, Frank found himself sitting next to Michael, Caroline's husband of 30 years. The two men had developed an easy friendship, bound by their love for the remarkable women in their lives. Caroline told me about the journals, Michael said quietly, that Margaret sent them to her before she died. Frank nodded. This wasn't news. He'd known for some time that Margaret had reached out to Caroline in her final days. What you might not know, Michael continued, is that Caroline wrote back. Frank turned to him in surprise. She wrote to Margaret? Michael nodded. One letter. Caroline didn't know if it arrived before the end, but she needed to write it anyway. What did it say? Frank asked, both dreading and needing to know. Michael was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It said, I forgive you. Thank you for loving her when I couldn't. She was never just yours or just mine. She was always her own person, a gift to the world. In another life, we might have been friends. Frank felt the impact of those words like a physical force, the generosity of spirit they represented, the healing they offered. Whether Margaret had read them or not, they completed a circle that had remained open for too long. Later that night, as the party wound down and families began to depart with hugs and promises to get together soon, Rebecca found Frank sitting alone on the porch swing. You okay, Dad? She asked, joining him on the swing. Better than okay, he assured her, just reflecting on life's strange turns. How the worst betrayals can sometimes lead to unexpected blessings. Rebecca rested her head on his shoulder, the way she had done since childhood. I've been thinking about forgiveness lately, she said. Not just forgiving Mom for what she did, but understanding why she did it. And, Frank prompted gently. I think she was trapped, Rebecca said thoughtfully. Once the lie began, each year made it harder to tell the truth. She must have been so afraid of losing us both, you and me. Frank considered this. Fear makes people do terrible things sometimes, even good people. And love makes people do extraordinary things, Rebecca added. Like Caroline, searching for decades. Like you, opening your heart to this impossible situation. Frank smiled at his daughter, this remarkable woman who had somehow found wisdom in circumstances that might have broken someone with less courage. The blue suitcase was full of longing, Rebecca continued. Mom's longing for a child, Caroline's longing for her daughter, and now it's full of something else: connection, forgiveness, new beginnings. As they rocked gently on the porch swing, watching the sun set over Caroline's garden, Frank felt a sense of peace that had been elusive since Margaret's death. The anger and betrayal he had felt upon discovering her deception had gradually transformed into something more complex, an understanding that people could be both deeply flawed and worthy of love. That forgiveness didn't erase the past, but created space for a different future. Your mother would be proud of you, he said softly. Both of them. Rebecca smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. 3 years to the day after Frank had opened the blue suitcase and discovered its secrets, the extended family gathered at the beach for a special occasion. Rebecca stood between Caroline and Frank, holding both their hands as a minister spoke words of blessing over their unusual but unbreakable bonds. It had been Rebecca's idea, not a legal ceremony, but a spiritual acknowledgement of what they had become to one another, a recognition that family could be chosen as well as given, built as well as born. As the minister invited them to share words they had prepared, Caroline spoke first, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of waves. 43 years ago I gave birth to a daughter I was told had died, she began. I never held a funeral, I never stopped searching. Today I am not burying that grief but transforming it into gratitude for the years Rebecca had with loving parents, into joy for the relationship we have built, into hope for the future we all share. Rebecca spoke next, her words deliberate and heartfelt. I stand between my two mothers and my father, one who gave me life, one who raised me with love, and one who has been my constant. I am the daughter of all of you, shaped by absence and presence, by truth and deception, by loss and discovery. Today I claim all of it as my inheritance, and my strength. Finally Frank stepped forward. Family isn't always what we expect, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Sometimes it breaks apart. Sometimes it expands in ways we never imagined possible. Today we acknowledge that love transcends the boundaries we try to place around it. That forgiveness is a choice we make not once, but every day. That healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from reimagining the future. As the small ceremony concluded, the assembled family, biological and chosen, related by blood and by circumstance, gathered closer, forming a circle on the beach. The blue suitcase sat open in the center, no longer a repository of secrets, but a symbol of transformation. Inside lay a new letter, written collectively by all of them, addressed to the future, to the children and grandchildren, who would someday hear this extraordinary story and wonder at the resilience of the human heart, at the complexity of truth and the power of forgiveness, at the way love, once released from confinement, finds its way to exactly where it belongs. As the sun set over the ocean, casting golden light over their gathered faces, Frank looked around the circle at this impossible family built from broken pieces, at Rebecca, standing tall and serene between her two mothers, at Caroline, whose decades of searching had ended not in the daughter she had lost, but in the family she had found. And he knew that Margaret, wherever she was, could finally rest in peace. Her greatest fear had not come true. The truth had not destroyed what she had built, but had instead transformed it into something even more beautiful. A testament to the human capacity for forgiveness, for growth, for love that expands beyond all boundaries. The letter in the blue suitcase had been just the beginning. The rest of the story they were writing together, one day at a time. Have you ever discovered a secret that changed everything you thought you knew about your family? Frank and Rebecca's journey reminds us that even the most painful truths can lead to healing when met with forgiveness and courage. Every family has stories beneath the surface, some waiting decades to be told. If this tale of hidden letters, long-lost connections, and the remarkable power of forgiveness touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone struggling to mend broken family bonds. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful stories of redemption and second chances to life. Until next time, remember that it's never too late for truth to transform tragedy into something beautiful, and sometimes family is found in the places we least expect. What family secret changed your life? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below.